Go ahead and get comfortable. Pull the blanket up a little higher if you need to. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. Feel the weight of your body settle into the mattress, into the pillow, into the quiet dark of wherever you are right now. There is nothing waiting for you tonight. No decisions, no unfinished things, no noise that matters. Just this voice and the soft darkness and a story that has been waiting a very long time to be told properly. Tonight, we are going somewhere most people think they already know. We are going to a castle. And I want you to picture it for a moment. The castle you already carry in your imagination. Maybe it is the one from a fairy tale. Maybe it is something you saw in a film or in a painting or in a dream. Stone towers rising above a green hillside, banners catching the wind, a great hall lit by torchlight, long tables crowded with laughter and roasted meat. Knights in bright armor, a lord at the high table, a lady in silk, serene and still, like a painting of herself. That castle is beautiful, and it is almost entirely a lie. Not a malicious lie, more like the lie a beautiful portrait tells. It shows you the surface, the posed moment, the face someone wanted the world to see, but portraits do not show you the smell of the room, or the cold draft coming under the door, or the sound of 100 people trying to sleep on a stone floor 6 feet below where you are sitting. History has handed us the portrait. Tonight, we are going into the room. Because the real medieval castle, the castle that actually existed, that real human beings woke up inside every morning, that smelled and echoed and leaked and groaned, was one of the most complicated, crowded, uncomfortable, and fascinating places in the entire medieval world. It was not a home in any sense we would recognize. It was not a palace. It was not a fortress exactly, though it could function like one. It was something stranger and more alive than any of those things. It was a world unto itself. And tonight, over the course of the next few hours, we are going to walk through it together, slowly, carefully, from the first gray light of morning to the last guttering candle of the night. We are going to hear what it sounded like before dawn, when the castle was already awake and working. We are going to sit at the tables of the great hall and understand, really understand, what it meant to be fed there, and where you sat, and what that said about who you were. We are going to stand in the rooms that no romantic painting ever bothered to depict. The cold ones, the dark ones, the ones that smelled of smoke and waste and animal and human all pressed together in the stone. We are going to follow the night as it fell over the battlements and crept into the corridors, and understand who slept where and why and what they feared in the dark. And then at the very end, we are going to find the people who made all of it function, the ones who were never painted, never chronicled, never named in the histories, and understand that they were perhaps the most important people in the entire building. If you are new here, this is Dreamy Ages, a channel for long, slow, immersive journeys into history's hidden rooms. If tonight's story finds you, I would love for you to subscribe and stay a while. Before we begin, I want to sit with something for just a moment longer. There is a reason we find castles so irresistible, not just beautiful, irresistible. We seek them out on holidays, we photograph them, we build miniature versions of them for children to play with. Something about the castle, even in ruin, even reduced to a few surviving walls and a grassy mound, still pulls at something deep in us. I think it is because a castle makes power visible in a way that a parliament building or a government office never quite manages. A castle shows you power as a physical, unmistakable stone and mortar fact. It says someone was here, someone was strong enough, wealthy enough, feared enough to build this. And everyone within sight of those walls knew it. But here is what the castle does not tell you. Standing there on its hill, it does not tell you about the smell. It does not tell you about the cold that crept through the walls in January, about the darkness at noon in a room with arrow-slit windows, about the particular misery of crossing a stone corridor in the night to find the garderobe, about the 300 people pressed against each other inside those magnificent walls, navigating rank and hunger and cold and boredom and loyalty and fear. It does not tell you about the life that happened inside it. That is what I am here for tonight. Now, let us begin at the beginning. Let us begin before sunrise. Because the castle was never, not for a single hour of any day, quiet. There is a particular kind of darkness that exists just before medieval dawn. Not the soft, electric-tinged darkness of a modern night, where somewhere, always, there is the glow of a screen or a street light bleeding under a curtain. This was a different darkness entirely. Complete, heavy, the kind of darkness that sits in a room like a presence. In the great stone keeps of medieval England and France and the German territories, in the castle towns of Castile and the hilltop fortresses of Tuscany, in the moated manors of the Low Countries and the windswept towers of Scotland, in all of these places, the darkness before dawn was absolute. And into that darkness, before the sun had touched even the highest parapet, came the first sound of the day. Not a bell, though bells would come soon enough. The first sound was simpler than that. It was footsteps. A single pair of footsteps, leather soles on stone, moving through a corridor somewhere below the sleeping quarters, where a young page boy or a lower servant had just been shaken awake from wherever he had slept, which, if he was lucky, was a narrow pallet near the kitchen hearth, and if he was not, was a corner of the great hall floor, wrapped in his own cloak with a bundle of straw for a pillow. His job, in those first minutes before dawn, was to begin the fire, to begin the water, to begin the slow, labor-intensive process of waking up a building that housed, depending on the castle, depending on the period, depending on the lord's wealth and the season and whether there were guests, anywhere from 60 to several hundred people. This is the first thing most people do not know about medieval castles. They were not empty. They were not sparsely populated strongholds where a lord and his family rattled around in stone corridors with a handful of servants for company. They were dense, busy, populated places. A mid-sized English castle in the 13th or 14th century might house between 100 and 200 people on any given ordinary day. A large household, the establishment of a major earl or a royal duke, could swell to 300 or more when guests arrived, when retainers came in from the estates, when a military campaign was being organized, or when the Lord was traveling and the entire household moved with him. Think about that for a moment. 300 people living inside a single complex of buildings, sharing the same water supply, the same air, the same fire, the same narrow staircases, the same overburdened kitchen. This was not a home. This was a village that happened to be made of stone and surrounded by a wall. And like any village, it had its own economy, its own social hierarchy, its own rules and customs and unspoken codes, its own internal geography that told you at every moment exactly where you stood, literally and figuratively, in the world. The people who lived inside a medieval castle can be organized into layers, though the reality was far more fluid and overlapping than any neat list suggests. At the very top, the Lord and his immediate family. In most castle households, this meant the Lord himself, a baron, an earl, a duke, a king in his traveling court, along with his wife, his children if they were young enough still to live at home, and the small circle of high-ranking attendants who were assigned specifically to their personal service. Just below this inner circle came the knights. In a large household, a lord might maintain a permanent retinue of 10, 20, 30 knights who lived within his walls, ate at his table, trained in his courtyards, and owed him their military service. These were not always men of great wealth in their own right. Many knights were younger sons of minor families who had attached themselves to a powerful lord in exchange for room, board, horses, and the chance of advancement. They were not servants, but they were not equals either. They occupied a complicated middle space that required constant social navigation. Then came the household officers, the steward, who managed the entire estate, the marshal, who oversaw the stables and the horses, the chamberlain, who controlled access to the lord's private quarters, the constable, who was responsible for the castle's defenses. These men were often of noble birth themselves, and their positions carried enormous real power. The steward of a great household controlled budgets, staff, food supplies, and the daily operations of an enterprise that would, in modern terms, resemble a small corporation. Below them, the pages and squires, young boys and adolescents sent from noble families to train in another lord's household, learning the arts of war and courtesy in exchange for service. Below them, the clerks and chaplains who handled the Lord's correspondence, his accounts, his spiritual obligations. Below them, the skilled craftsmen who were attached permanently to the household, the blacksmith, the carpenter, the falconer, the huntsman. And below all of these, the vast, largely anonymous body of household servants who did the actual physical work of keeping the place functioning, the cooks and scullions, the laundresses, the grooms who tended the horses, the boys who carried wood and water, the women who made the beds and emptied the chamber pots and swept the rushes on the great hall floor. Every single one of these people woke up before the Lord did. Every single one of them had a role that had to be performed before the most powerful person in the building opened his eyes. And so the castle's morning did not begin with the Lord descending a grand staircase. It began hours earlier, in the dark, with footsteps and with fire. The fires were the first priority, always, in a building made entirely of stone, with walls that might be 10 or 12 feet thick, and windows that were barely slits. The preservation of warmth was not a comfort. It was a survival matter. The great hall fire, the kitchen fire, the fires in the private chambers of the Lord and his family, these had to be coaxed back to life from the banked coals of the night before, fed with fresh wood, stoked and tended until they were burning steadily enough to begin doing what was needed. In the kitchen, which in most large castles was a separate building or at least a heavily isolated room, to reduce the risk of the catastrophic fires that periodically destroyed entire castle complexes, the work had to begin even earlier, because breakfast for several hundred people did not simply appear. It was produced through hours of labor that began when the rest of the world was still dark. The castle's water supply was another morning priority, and this was not as simple as turning a tap. Water had to be drawn from a well within the castle walls if the castle was designed properly, from a source outside the walls if it was not, and carried in barrels and buckets and great clay pots to the kitchen, to the stables, to the washing areas, to wherever it was needed. In a large household, the daily water requirements were staggering. Cooking, cleaning, drinking, washing, watering animals, a castle of 200 people and their horses consumed quantities of water that required a dedicated effort to procure every single morning. And while all of this was happening in the lower reaches of the castle, the world above was beginning to stir. In the great hall, which in many castles served not just as a dining room, but as a general sleeping space for the lower servants, the pages, and any guests of middling rank, bodies were beginning to shift and wake. The hall floor, covered in its layer of rushes and scattered with herbs to mask the smell, would have been a landscape of recumbent figures as recently as 2 hours ago. Now those figures were rising, folding cloaks that had served as blankets, stamping feet against the cold of the stone beneath the rushes, finding their places in the morning's hierarchy of tasks. The noise of the castle's morning was layered and constant. The distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer, beginning early because the forge required time to reach working temperature, the sound of horses in the stables, the shifting, stamping, occasional whinny of animals that needed to be fed and watered and mucked out before anything else could happen in the yard. The voices of servants calling to one another across the courtyard, short, functional, the language of people who had done this 1,000 times before and knew exactly what needed to be said. The creak of the well rope, the splash of water into a barrel, the crack of wood being split somewhere near the kitchen. And underneath all of it, always the sound of stone. Medieval castles were extraordinarily good at transmitting sound. The bare stone walls and flagged floors reflected noise rather than absorbing it, which meant that the castle's acoustic landscape was simultaneously intimate and disorienting. You could hear a conversation happening 2 floors above you. You could hear the sound of someone's boots on a staircase at the far end of the building. Nothing happened in a medieval castle in true silence. There was no privacy in sound. There was, in fact, almost no privacy of any kind. And that is where we are going next, into the great hall as the morning fully opens, and into the extraordinary, intricate, deeply human world of what it meant to live cheek by jowl with hundreds of other people inside those stone walls, stratified by every detail of where you sat, what you ate, and how close you were allowed to stand to the most powerful person in the room. If you have ever walked into a room and immediately felt the invisible architecture of social hierarchy, The way certain people occupy the center and others drift to the edges, the way some voices carry and others wait, then you already understand something essential about the medieval Great Hall. Because the Great Hall was, above all things, a machine for making hierarchy visible. Every castle of any significance had one. It was the largest interior space in the complex, typically rectangular, often running 40 to 60 feet in length in a substantial establishment with a high timber-beamed ceiling that trapped smoke and warmth in equal measure. At one end was the dais, a raised platform, sometimes only a few inches above the main floor level, sometimes a full step or two, where the high table sat. At the other end was the screens passage, a narrow corridor created by a wooden screen that separated the hall proper from the service areas, the buttery where drink was stored, the pantry where bread was kept, and the passageway to the kitchen. Between these two ends stretched the hall itself, and the hall was not merely a dining room. It was a theater. Every meal served in the Great Hall was a performance, a carefully choreographed, heavily symbolic enactment of exactly who held power, who had access to that power, and in precisely what degree. The most important object in the entire hall was not the fireplace. Though the fireplace was enormous, it was not the Lord's chair, though the Lord's chair was the grandest in the room. It was a small ceramic or silver vessel placed at a specific point on the high table. It was the salt cellar. In the medieval hall, the placement of the salt cellar was the dividing line of the social universe. To sit above the salt, that is, between the salt and the Lord, was to be of high rank, a knight, a noble guest, a senior household officer, a valued member of the inner circle. To sit below the salt was to be of lower status, a minor retainer, a tradesman, a visitor of no great importance, the middling ranks of the household staff who were permitted to eat in the hall at all. The salt itself, in the medieval period, was not cheap. Salt was a preserved commodity, a traded good, something that took effort and expense to produce and transport. Its placement at the center of the table was not arbitrary. It marked a real and meaningful threshold, and everyone in the room knew exactly where they were in relation to it. The meals themselves followed a ritual that would have been entirely familiar to anyone in that hall, repeated as it was at least twice a day. Dinner in the late morning or early afternoon, supper in the early evening, with a consistency that was itself a form of social glue. Before food appeared, there was water. Servants moved through the hall with ewers and basins, pouring water over the hands of the diners, starting always at the high table, moving in descending order of rank. Hand washing before meals was not merely hygienic. It was ceremonial. It announced that the meal was beginning. It marked the transition from the world of work or travel or conversation into the world of the table. Then came the bread. The bread in a medieval great hall was not all the same bread. The finest white manchet bread, made from the most carefully sifted flour, appeared at the high table. Coarser brown bread, made from less refined grain, appeared further down, and at the very lowest tables, or for the servants eating in shifts in the kitchen itself, the bread might be yesterday's or the day before's, used to sop up liquid from stews and pottages, then eaten or discarded as the appetite dictated. The meat courses were served with equal precision. At the high table, The most prized cuts, the most elaborate preparations, the dishes that the kitchen had spent the most time producing, roasted game birds, elaborate meat pies with decorated pastry crusts, fish prepared in complex sauces if it was a fasting day, which the church mandated with considerable frequency roughly a third of the year when meat was officially forbidden. Further down the hall, the dishes simplified. More stewed meat, less roasted. More bread, less variety. The further you sat from the Lord, the plainer your plate, and the later you were served, because the serving began at the high table and worked its way down. This is what I find so striking about the medieval hall. When I sit with it long enough, the inequality was not hidden. It was not dressed up or softened or apologized for. It was displayed proudly and deliberately in full sight of everyone present. You knew at every meal exactly where you stood, and so did everyone else. The hall made the social order legible in the most literal, physical sense. You could see it in who had white bread and who had brown, in who was served first and who was served last, in who sat on a cushioned chair at the high table and who perched on a bench below the salt, with their elbows crowded against their neighbors. And yet, and this is the part that complicates the picture beautifully, the great hall also brought everyone together in a way that almost no other medieval institution did. Lord and Lois Scullion ate in the same room, breathed the same smoke-thickened air, heard the same music if there were musicians, the same prayers if there was a chaplain reading grace, the same laughter when something struck someone as funny 2 tables away. There was a strange intimacy in that shared space, even across the vast gulf of rank and privilege, an intimacy that would have been entirely legible to everyone present. The hall said, "You are all part of this household. You are all, in some sense, mine to feed and shelter, and you are all, in some equally clear sense, not the same. Both things at once, every day, twice a day." The dogs understood none of this, of course. Medieval great halls were full of dogs, not just 1 or 2 pets, proper packs of hunting dogs of mixed breeds kept for varied purposes, who moved freely through the hall during meals, who were thrown bones from the tables, who caused occasional chaos when 2 of them decided to settle a grievance under a bench where people were trying to eat. Dog management during meals was a genuine logistical concern, and some households employed a specific servant, the dog whipper, whose job was exactly what it sounds like. The rushes on the floor were partly there for the dogs, or rather, the rushes were there for warmth and cushioning and to provide a surface that was easier to clean than bare stone. But they accumulated over time a remarkable quantity of material, bones thrown from the tables, spilled drink, food that missed its target, dog waste. The detritus of hundreds of daily meals, pressed down and partially covered by new rushes spread on top of the old. The smell was significant. Herbs were strewn among the rushes specifically to manage the smell. Lavender, mint, rosemary, meadowsweet, and great households changed their rushes more frequently than poor ones, but no amount of herbs entirely conquered what accumulated on a hall floor between changings. When the 16th century scholar Erasmus visited England and described English houses, he wrote with considerable feeling about the state of their floor rushes, which he described as covering ancient layers of accumulated matter stretching back years. The medieval great hall, at its most fragrant, smelled of wood smoke and roasting meat and spilled ale and fresh rushes. At its most honest, it smelled of all those things plus everything else that several hundred people and their animals generated over the course of a day. But here is what I want you to hold on to as we move deeper into the castle tonight. The hall was the public face. The hall was where the Lord performed his lordship, where the household performed its loyalty, where everyone performed their rank. It was the most visible space in the building, the most theatrical, the most deliberately constructed to communicate power. What lay beyond it, the private chambers, the back stairs, the service corridors, the spaces the portraits never showed, told a very different story. And that is precisely where we are going next. We are stepping away from the firelight of the great hall, away from the high table and the salt cellar and the careful choreography of rank. We are going into the parts of the castle that the castle did not particularly want you to think about. The cold parts, the dark parts, the parts where the stone told the truth. Beyond the great hall, the castle's architecture became a map of discomfort. This is the part of the story that the paintings always left out, not because the painters were dishonest, exactly, but because the spaces that made up the real, functional, lived-in castle were not the spaces anyone wanted to commemorate. No one commissioned a portrait of the garderobe. No illuminated manuscript lovingly depicted the drainage channel running along the base of the outer wall. The images that survived were the images of aspiration, the hall in its best light, the chamber at its most arranged, the garden in summer bloom. The rest of the castle existed in the documentary record only as a practical concern. Requests for repair, complaints about drafts, accounts of building work, notes in household ledgers about the cost of firewood and candles. But those practical records are, in many ways, more honest than the paintings. And they tell a story of a building that was, by almost any modern standard, profoundly uncomfortable to live in. Let us begin with the cold. Stone is an extraordinarily poor insulator. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly, which means that in summer a stone building stays cooler than the air outside, which is pleasant, but in winter the same properties work in reverse. A stone castle in December was not merely cool. It was actively, aggressively cold. The walls themselves, 12 feet thick in places, deeply shaded by battlements and by other buildings crowded against them, radiated cold into every room they enclosed. Tapestries hung on the walls were not merely decorative. They were insulation. A bare stone wall in a medieval chamber was a surface that pulled warmth from the air and from any body that stood near it. A tapestry-covered wall trapped a thin buffer of air between the hanging and the stone, and that buffer made a genuine difference to the temperature of the room. Floor coverings served the same function. Stone floors in winter were brutal. Not just cold to the foot, but cold in a way that rose through the legs and into the body, a slow seeping chill that no amount of clothing entirely counteracted. Rushes on the floor, carpets in the finest rooms, layers of straw in the lesser spaces. All of these were practical responses to the reality of living on stone. The fireplaces were real, the fires were real, but their effectiveness was limited in a way that is difficult to convey to anyone accustomed to central heating. A medieval fireplace heated the area immediately in front of it. The rest of the room remained cold. In a great hall of 50 feet long, the fire at one end created a bubble of warmth, perhaps 15-20 feet in radius, beyond which the temperature dropped sharply. The people who sat closest to the fire were the most senior, the most privileged, the most entitled to warmth. The people who sat at the far end of the hall, below the salt, further from the high table, were also further from the fire. Cold and low status were not merely metaphorically connected. They were physically connected every day in the layout of every hall. The Lord's private chambers, the solar, as it was often called, a word derived from the Latin for sun, reflecting its position on the south-facing upper floor of the castle where it might catch the most light, were better heated than the hall, but not by as much as the word private might suggest. A lord of middling wealth might have a fireplace in his solar, a fireplace in his wife's chamber, and perhaps a brazier of hot coals in his children's room if he was feeling generous. Beyond that, the heating stopped. The corridors were not heated. The stairwells were not heated. The service spaces, the pantries, the rooms where the lesser staff worked and slept, these were heated only by whatever warmth human bodies generated, which in winter was not sufficient. Candles and torches added heat as well as light, and in a room crowded with enough candles and enough bodies, a slight improvement over the stone's baseline temperature was possible, but the baseline itself was unforgiving. The light situation was, in some ways, even more striking. We are so accustomed to the idea that night is banishable, that we can convert darkness into day with the flip of a switch, that it requires genuine effort to imagine a world in which darkness was simply a condition of life between sunset and sunrise, and in which even the daylight hours were rationed by the size of your windows. Medieval castle windows were small. Not universally, later medieval buildings show a progressive enlargement of windows as glazing technology improved and as the defensive priorities that had originally shaped the castle's design became less urgent. But in the great stone keeps of the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, windows were slits. Arrow loops, sometimes called loopholes, were designed first for defense, narrow enough that an attacker could not easily shoot through them from outside, but wide enough to allow a defender inside to angle a bow. Larger windows existed in the upper floors of the castle, in the private chambers, in the chapel, but even these were modest by later standards, and glazing was expensive enough that many castle windows used oiled linen or thin scraped animal hide or wooden shutters rather than glass. A room lit by 2 or 3 small windows on an overcast December day in northern England was very nearly as dark as the same room at night with a candle. This is why candles were not a luxury but a survival requirement. A castle without candles was a castle that could not function after noon in December, and the difference between the candles the Lord used and the candles the servants used was, itself, a legible mark of rank. The finest rooms smelled of clean beeswax. The corridors and lower quarters smelled of burning tallow, which is to say they smelled of rendered animal fat, which is to say they smelled of exactly what they were. The smell of a medieval castle was, to put it delicately, layered. There is a tendency, when people think about historical smell, to imagine it as uniformly bad, and certainly there were spaces in any medieval castle that smelled, by any standard, terrible. But the olfactory reality was more complex than simple badness. It was a dense, multivalent combination of many different sources, some of which were actually pleasant and all of which were constant. Wood smoke, first and always, in any room with a fire, and in many corridors connecting rooms with fires, smoke was a background condition. Medieval fireplaces did not draw perfectly. They were not engineered to the precise specifications of modern flues, and they responded to wind direction and weather in ways that sometimes filled a room with smoke rather than pulling it up and out. Tapestries, clothing, hair, everything in a medieval castle interior smelled of smoke because everything had been living in smoke for its entire existence. Food smells from the kitchen permeated the building in ways that were sometimes appetizing and sometimes not. The smell of roasting meat on a morning when the kitchen was producing its best work was, presumably, genuine pleasure. The smell of the same kitchen on a summer afternoon when the waste pits were full and the heat had been working on yesterday's scraps was a different proposition entirely. Animals were everywhere, and animals smell. The horses in the stables, which were typically located within the castle walls in the outer courtyard, produced an olfactory presence that was simply part of the air of any castle yard. Hunting dogs moved freely through the hall, as we have already seen. Falcons were kept in the mews, sometimes within the main castle complex. Livestock, pigs, poultry, the occasional cow, might be kept in outer areas, but outer in a castle context still meant within the walls, still meant within the common air. And then there was the garderobe. The garderobe was the medieval castle's solution to human waste disposal. The name itself is a word of elegant deflection. In French, it means wardrobe, a term borrowed from the practice of hanging clothes in these small chambers on the logic that ammonia from below deterred moths. But its function was straightforwardly a latrine. Garderobes were built into the thickness of the castle wall. Small recesses, sometimes barely large enough to turn around in, with a stone seat over a shaft that dropped either straight down the exterior of the castle wall into a pit at the base, or into a cesspit that was periodically cleaned out by a specialized worker whose job title, should you ever come across it in a medieval household account, was gong farmer. The gong farmer worked at night, by preference. He cleaned the cesspits manually, removing their contents into carts that were then taken outside the castle walls. It was the worst job in a building full of difficult jobs, and the gong farmer was accordingly paid quite well, better in many records than the people whose waste he was removing. Necessity has always commanded its own price. Garderobes existed at multiple points in a castle, their number and distribution depending on the size of the building and the priorities of its builder. The finest establishments had garderobes opening from the private chambers of the lord and his family, a significant luxury, meaning they did not have to traverse cold corridors in the night. Others had garderobes in stairwell recesses, accessible to several floors. The lower staff used communal facilities in the outer areas of the castle, or used chamber pots that were then carried out. The drainage from garderobes ran down the outside of the castle walls, and it left marks that are still visible on the stonework of surviving medieval castles today. Long vertical stains in the masonry, mineral traces of centuries of use. The exterior of a castle wall, seen honestly, was not only a defensive structure, it was a drainage system. What I find so telling, thinking about the garderobe, is how matter-of-fact it was. There was no pretense in the design, no attempt to architecturally disguise what it was or what it did. It was built into the wall because it had to be somewhere, and the wall was the most practical place. The medieval relationship with bodily functions was simply more direct than ours, more visible, less disguised by the elaborate infrastructures of pipes and porcelain and chemical treatment that allow modern people to largely pretend the whole business isn't happening. In a medieval castle, it was always visibly, audibly, olfactorily happening. And everyone understood this to be simply the nature of things. Baths were another area where the reality diverged significantly from the popular imagination, though in a more interesting direction than most people expect. Medieval people bathed, not as infrequently as the Victorian era's caricature of the Middle Ages would have you believe. The idea that medieval people almost never washed is largely a myth, born partly from Victorian condescension toward the past, and partly from the absence of the kind of plumbing infrastructure that makes bathing effortless. In fact, household accounts and personal correspondence from the medieval period regularly reference bathing, and the church itself, while occasionally suspicious of the Roman bathhouse tradition as a potential site of moral laxity, did not oppose personal cleanliness. What differed was the method and the frequency. Bathing in a castle required a wooden tub, usually a large barrel or half-barrel shape, dragged into a private chamber and filled with water that had been heated in the kitchen and then carried, bucket by servants, upstairs and along corridors, to wherever the tub had been placed. This was an enormous amount of labor for a single bath. A bath for the lord of the castle required the coordinated effort of multiple servants over an extended period of time. It was, in the truest sense, a privilege of rank, not because washing was considered a luxury in itself, but because the infrastructure required to produce hot water in a convenient quantity was significant. The water was often scented. Herbs, lavender, roses, chamomile might be added to the tub. This was partly pleasant and partly practical. Fragrant herbs had a mild antiseptic quality, and the smell helped to counteract the smell of the tallow candles and the wood smoke and everything else that permeated castle life. After the lord bathed, the water might be reused by his wife or by senior members of the household in declining order of status. By the time the water reached the lower servants, it was cold and gray and not particularly effective as a cleansing agent, but the ritual of having been bathed was itself meaningful. The lesser staff washed in simpler ways: cold water from the well, a cloth, a basin, the kind of washing that requires no infrastructure, only access to water and a few minutes of privacy, which, as we will see, was itself not always easily available in the densely populated world of the castle. Because privacy, real privacy, sustained privacy, the kind that modern people take entirely for granted, was one of the great luxuries of the medieval world, and within the castle, it was distributed as unequally as everything else. The stone walls were thick, but they were not thick enough to keep sound out, and in the most intimate chambers, the most personal moments, the most private hours, there was almost always someone else in the room. That is where we are going next, into the night, into the sleeping hours and the extraordinary, revealing world of what it meant to rest inside a medieval castle when the fires burned low and the gates were locked and the darkness settled over the stone like a hand pressing down. Stay with me, because what lies beyond the great hall is where the castle stops performing and starts telling the truth. There is a moment, somewhere in the deep middle of a winter afternoon in a medieval castle, when the light gives up, not gradually, not with any grace. It simply retreats, pulling back from the narrow windows, thinning from gray to gray blue to something that is almost no color at all. And the stone absorbs what remains until the room is more dark than light, and the candles become necessary, and the fire becomes everything. This is the moment I want you to hold in your mind as we go deeper tonight. Not the grand moment, not the feast, not the tournament, not the formal occasion with its banners and its ceremony and its careful performance of power. The other moment. The ordinary one, the one that happened every single day in every season to every person inside those walls, regardless of their rank or their name or their place at the table. The moment when the castle simply had to be survived. And I use that word deliberately, survived. Not endured, not managed, survived in the active sense. The sense that requires daily effort and attention and the specific knowledge of how to function within a particular set of physical constraints. The people who lived inside medieval castles were not passive inhabitants of a difficult environment. They had developed over generations a comprehensive and sophisticated understanding of how to make life workable inside stone walls. They knew where to stand to stay warm. They knew which rooms to avoid in which seasons. They knew the timing of the kitchen fires and the schedule of the water carriers and the exact rhythm of the canonical bells that structured every day. This knowledge was not written down. It was lived. It was passed from person to person through the simple mechanism of being there, doing the thing, watching someone else do the thing, and learning. The castle was, in this sense, an education in itself. To grow up inside one was to absorb gradually and completely an entire system of knowledge about how to inhabit a particular kind of world, a world of stone and fire and cold and hierarchy. A world with its own rules, its own rhythms, its own map of danger and comfort. A world that looked, from the outside, like a symbol of power, and was, from the inside, simply the place where you lived. We have walked through the morning already. We have heard the first footsteps in the dark corridor, the fire being coaxed to life, the castle beginning its daily noise. We have sat in the great hall and understood what it meant to eat in a room where your position relative to a salt cellar told the entire room exactly who you were. We have smelled the wood smoke and the rushes and the things the rushes were trying to cover. Now we are going into the parts of the castle that the Great Hall performance was designed to make you forget. The cold, the dark, the smell of stone when the fire is not enough. The small stone room off the corridor where privacy was not a comfort but a structural reality and not always a pleasant one. The places where the architecture of the castle stopped being about power and started being about the bare fact of keeping several hundred human bodies alive through another winter. This is the castle behind the castle, and it is the most honest version of the story. The first thing to understand about medieval heating, truly understand, not just intellectually acknowledge, is that warmth in a stone castle was not a state, it was a direction. You moved toward it or away from it. You were warmer or colder depending on where you stood, how close you were to the fire, how many other bodies occupied the room with you, how recently the door had been opened to the corridor outside. Warmth was not ambient. It did not fill a space the way modern central heating does, arriving invisibly through vents, distributing itself evenly. making the temperature of one corner of a room indistinguishable from another. Medieval warmth was a specific, located thing. It came from a specific source, and it faded with distance from that source in a way that was immediate and measurable by the body. The great hall fire was the largest in the castle. In the earliest stone keeps, the great square towers of the Norman period, built in the late 11th and early 12th centuries, the fire was sometimes built in the center of the hall floor, with a hole in the roof above to let the smoke out. This worked, after a fashion, though the smoke was unpredictable and the hole in the roof was a genuine engineering challenge in wet weather. Later hall design moved the fireplace to one of the side walls, building a proper hearth with a chimney, an improvement in smoke management, though it meant that the fire's warmth now radiated outward from one wall rather than from the center, creating an even more pronounced gradient between the heated end of the hall and the far end near the screens passage, where in winter the temperature could be genuinely brutal. A hall fire of the medieval type, burning wood, sometimes augmented with peat, in a fireplace that might be 8 or 10 feet wide, produced a tremendous amount of heat in its immediate vicinity. Sit close enough and you would be too warm, your face flushed and tight, the front of you uncomfortably hot while your back remained cold. This is a sensation that anyone who has sat close to a large open fire knows well. The medieval solution to this problem was the same as the modern campfire solution. You rotated. You turned yourself periodically, like something on a spit, warming one side and then the other. The Lord's private solar fared somewhat better, being positioned on an upper floor on the south-facing side of the castle where it received the most sunlight through its windows. The solar benefited from both its own fireplace and from whatever passive solar gain the thin winter sun could provide. In a well-built castle with a properly oriented solar, the difference between this room and the great hall in midwinter could be noticeable: warmer, quieter, more contained. This was not accident. It was the whole point of the solar's design. Privacy and warmth were, in the medieval castle, inseparable concepts. Only the most privileged had reliable access to both. Below the solar, things deteriorated quickly. The service spaces, the buttery, the pantry, the rooms where the household's working stores were kept were not heated at all. Cold storage was in many cases a feature rather than a deficiency. Wine kept better at a stable, cool temperature. Certain foods required cool conditions for preservation, and the labor involved in heating non-essential spaces was simply not worth the wood. The people who worked in these spaces wore their cloaks indoors. They moved quickly, efficiently, generating warmth through activity because there was no other source available. The storerooms and undercrofts, the vaulted basement spaces found beneath many castle structures, used for storing grain, salt, preserved meat, barrels of ale, and the vast quantities of provisions required to keep a large household fed through the winter, were among the coldest spaces in the building. They were also, in their way, among the most important. The undercroft was where the castle's survival lived. All that food, all that provision against the lean months, all that carefully preserved and stored and catalogued stock, it sat in the cold and the dark of the lower castle, tended by the cellars and the pantlers and the staff whose job was to know exactly what was there and exactly how long it would last. Going into the undercroft was, in winter, an exercise in genuine cold, breath misted, fingers stiffened. The work was done quickly, and you climbed back up to the warmer levels as soon as you could. And through all of this, through the hierarchy of cold and warm that mapped itself so precisely onto the hierarchy of rank, the candles burned. Let us talk about the candles, because candles in a medieval castle were not background detail, they were infrastructure. A large castle household might burn several hundred candles in a single day. The chandlery, the department responsible for producing, storing, and distributing candles, employed dedicated staff and operated under a budget that appears regularly in surviving household accounts because it was a significant and non-negotiable expense. You could not run a castle without candles, any more than you could run it without firewood or water or bread. Light was not optional, it was operational. The distinction between tallow candles and beeswax candles was a distinction of rank made manifest in light itself. Tallow candles, rendered from beef or mutton fat, the byproduct of the kitchen's slaughtering operations, were the workhorses. They were cheap enough to produce in quantity. They gave reasonable light. They were used freely in the corridors, the service areas, the hall, the sleeping quarters of the lesser staff. Their disadvantage was the smell. Burning tallow produces a distinctive odor, fatty, slightly acrid, animal, that was simply part of the atmospheric texture of any lower or middling castle space. You stopped noticing it if you had grown up with it. Visitors noticed it immediately. Beeswax candles burned cleaner, brighter, and with almost no smoke or smell. They were also significantly more expensive. Honey production in medieval Europe was important enough that bees and their products were carefully managed and highly valued, and beeswax as the byproduct of that production carried real cost. Beeswax candles appeared in the Lord's chambers in the chapel, at the high table during formal meals. Their presence was a signal of expense and therefore of status, as deliberate and legible as the white bread or the embroidered tablecloth. The chapel deserves particular mention here. Every castle of any significance had one. Sometimes it was a dedicated freestanding building within the castle walls. Sometimes it was a chapel chamber built into the upper floors of the keep itself, positioned in many cases directly above the great hall, so that the spiritual life of the household occupied the same vertical space as its daily communal eating. The chapel was the best lit room in many castles. Its candles burned continuously, or nearly so. Its windows, if the Lord could afford it, were glazed, sometimes with plain glass, sometimes with colored glass that cast warm, jewel-toned light across the stone floor during the hours when the winter sun was low enough to come through directly. It was the warmest room in another sense, too. A castle chapel was not merely a room for prayer. It was the emotional and psychological center of the household. The rhythms of the canonical hours, matins in the deep night, lauds at dawn, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, structured the day for everyone in the building, from the lord to the lowest kitchen boy. The bells that marked these hours were the castle's clock, its heartbeat, the audible frame within which all the day's work was organized. What I find quietly moving about this, when I consider it carefully, is that the bells made no distinction. They rang for everyone. the scullion who had been awake since before dawn, and the lord who had slept in a curtained bed with clean linen, the same bell reached both of them. The same prayers in the castle chapel were said for the household as a whole. The church offered, in this sense, a kind of equality that the great hall's salt cellar explicitly denied. The spiritual calendar belonged to everyone. Whether everyone experienced that equality as genuinely meaningful is another question, but the bells rang and everyone heard them. Now let us go to the room that every account of the medieval castle dances around and very few describe directly. But before we go to the room no one painted, I want to step outside for a moment. Literally outside, into the castle yard. Because the inner courtyard of a medieval castle was one of the most revealing spaces in the entire complex, and it is a space that gets surprisingly little attention in most accounts of castle life. The great hall receives its due, the solar, the chapel, the battlements, these get their moments. But the yard itself, the open ground enclosed by the castle walls, was where the life of the building was most honestly visible. In the yard, all pretense of hierarchy softened slightly, because the yard was a working space, and working spaces have their own democracy of function. The yard was where the well stood, the primary water source for the entire castle, around which a constant traffic of servants moved all day, drawing and carrying. It was where the farrier worked, shaping hot iron to the hooves of the castle's horses, the hammer ringing off the yard walls in a way that reached every room in the building. It was where deliveries arrived, the carts of firewood and grain and salted fish and barrels of wine, the livestock driven in from the outlying estates, the merchants with goods to sell. A castle yard in the middle of a working day was loud. It smelled of horse and forge and whatever the kitchen was discarding through the back passage. It was crossed constantly by people moving between the various functional spaces of the complex. The stables in one corner, the kitchen in another, the well at the center, the gatehouse at the entrance. If you stood in the middle of it, and simply watched for an hour, you would see the entire social world of the castle on display, but moving, purposeful, stripped of the theatrical formality of the hall. The yard was also where certain kinds of punishment happened. The pillory in some establishments stood in the yard. Public correction for offenses against the household's rules was administered in a space where everyone could witness it. The message was the same as the salt cellar's message, but delivered more bluntly. The hierarchy is real, the rules are real, and the consequences of violating them are not private. And the yard was where children played. This detail tends to get lost in accounts of medieval castle life, but children were present in these buildings in significant numbers. The lord's own children, obviously, but also the children of the castle's servants and craftsmen whose families often lived within or near the walls. The pages who came for training were themselves children, many of them no older than 8 or 9 when they arrived. The yard was where they ran and kicked things and got underfoot and were occasionally cuffed by a passing adult who had more important things to manage. In the middle of all that serious, hierarchical, carefully ordered world, children being children, in a yard that smelled of horses, I find that unexpectedly comforting. Now, the garderobe. We have established what it was and where its shaft went, but what the earlier description could not fully convey is what it felt like to use one, which is the detail that, once you sit with it, changes everything. The garderobe chamber was cold, always, not the ordinary cold of a stone corridor, but a cutting, channeled cold that rose up through the shaft from outside, outdoor air moving upward, winter or summer. In January, crossing the castle to find the garderobe in the night was a commitment, a small act of will performed in the dark, barefoot on stone, in cold that had been sitting in the walls since sunset. The chamber pots that substituted for those who could not face the walk were carried out and emptied each morning by the servants whose particular assignment this was, a task recorded in household accounts with the same matter-of-fact brevity as any other supply entry, because it was simply another of the invisible labors that kept the castle's surface appearance of dignity intact. That phrase, the surface appearance of dignity, captures something essential. The surface appearance of dignity. That phrase is worth sitting with for a moment. Because so much of the castle's daily architecture was about maintaining exactly that. The rushes on the hall floor disguised what accumulated beneath them. The herbs among the rushes disguised the rushes. The tapestries disguised the cold stone behind them. The elaborate rituals of serving, the hand-washing, the careful order of the courses, the ceremonial presentation of the Lord's food, disguised the chaos and labor of the kitchen that produced it. Every layer of the castle's visual and social presentation was, in some sense, a management of reality, a curation of what was seen and what was not, a performance of order and beauty over the inescapably complex, smelly, cold, noisy, crowded truth of what it actually took to sustain life inside those walls. And this was not hypocrisy, not exactly. It was something more human than that. It was the recognition, built into the very architecture of the building, into the design of the great hall and the positioning of the high table and the color of the candles and the herbs on the floor, that people need beauty, that the enactment of order, even over disorder, serves a purpose, that the performance of dignity, even when dignity is difficult to sustain, holds something important together. The castle was a lie, yes, but it was a lie that people lived inside and found, somehow, livable. And livable, for most of its inhabitants, was the best that could be honestly hoped for. Before we follow the darkness in, there is one more daylight reality worth pausing on. The castle's relationship with illness. In a building housing 200 people or more, sharing water, sharing air, sharing the close quarters of hall and corridor and sleeping space, disease moved with a speed and thoroughness that no amount of herb strewing could prevent. The medieval period was not ignorant of contagion. People understood, experientially if not scientifically, that illness spread between people in proximity, and castle households took practical measures in response. Infected members of the household were sometimes isolated in specific rooms. The water supply was a constant concern, and a well that became contaminated, through proximity to the cesspits, through a dead animal, through any of the ways that medieval water sources could be compromised, was a crisis that could disable an entire household within days. The castle's infirmary, where one existed, was typically a small room or set of rooms separated from the main sleeping areas. In a great ecclesiastical establishment, an abbey or cathedral close, the infirmary was a developed, well-staffed facility. In a secular castle household, it was more likely a room designated for the purpose when needed, tended by whoever in the household had the most relevant knowledge, which, as we have discussed at length in other journeys we have taken together, was most often a woman. The lady of the castle, or the senior women of her household, maintained the medical stores, the dried herbs, the tinctures, the poultices, the simple remedies accumulated through experience and passed down through practice. When a child developed fever, when a knight returned from training with an infected wound, when a servant collapsed with the summer flux, it was these women who were called, not a university physician, because a university physician was not there. This is worth holding for a moment, because it connects the castle to the broader story of medieval medicine in a way that feels important. The castle's medical provision was embedded in its domestic structure. It was not separate from the running of the household. It was part of it. One more task assigned to the women whose labor kept the castle alive in ways that the formal records rarely acknowledged. The medicine cabinet sat next to the food store. The knowledge of herbs sat next to the knowledge of accounts. These were not different domains for the women who held them. They were simply different aspects of the same comprehensive responsibility. But illness was not the only fear the castle harbored. There was the fear of fire. Castle fires were not uncommon in the historical record, and their causes were entirely predictable given the building's contents. Open flames in every room, tallow candles burning in corridors, sparks from the kitchen forge, rushes on the floor that were essentially a layer of dry kindling. The records of medieval castle and manor fires are sobering. Entire buildings were lost. People died. Years of accumulated wealth, the tapestries, the furniture, the documents, the stored provisions, went in hours. Castle builders were aware of this risk, and castle design incorporated fire management thinking in ways that are sometimes visible in surviving structures. The separation of the kitchen from the main hall, often a gap of 10 or 20 feet, sometimes connected by a covered passageway but not physically continuous, was primarily a fire precaution. The stone vaulting of the undercroft protected the stored provisions below from a fire in the hall above. The layout of the inner rooms, with their multiple doorways and interconnecting corridors, allowed for a degree of fire containment if a blaze was caught quickly enough. But containment depended on detection, and detection depended on someone being awake. This is why the overnight fire watch was not merely a domestic duty. It was a genuine safety function, as important to the castle's survival as the armed watch on the battlements. The person who sat beside the banking hall fire in the deep hours of the night, keeping half an eye on it between dozes, was performing a service that the entire building depended on. Anonymous service, unrecorded service. Like so much of what kept the castle alive. Which brings us at last to the night. To the moment when the performance ended and the building settled into its most honest hours. The dark ones, the quiet ones, the ones that revealed more than any other time of day exactly what the castle really was and who it really contained. The gates were closing, the fires were banking, the candles were guttering out one by one. And we are going to follow the darkness in. Night in a medieval castle did not arrive slowly. It arrived as a decision. The decision to close the gates. In most castle establishments of the high medieval period, the Great Gate, the main entrance through the outer wall, controlled by a portcullis of iron-tipped wood that could be dropped in seconds if the mechanism was released, and by heavy wooden doors that swung on iron hinges, was closed and locked at a specific time each evening. This time varied with the season. Earlier in winter, when darkness came sooner and the roads outside became genuinely dangerous. Later in summer, when the long light extended the usable day. But the moment of gate closing was fixed and known and meaningful. When the gate closed, the castle became a sealed world. Everything that needed to be inside was inside. Everyone who was going to sleep within those walls was already within them. The world outside, the road, the village, the dark fields, the forest that in most of the medieval period pressed considerably closer to human settlements than any modern person would find comfortable, was shut out. And the castle turned inward to the business of the night. The watch was posted first. On the battlements, in the gatehouse, at points around the outer wall that the castle's constable judged strategically necessary, guards took up their positions as darkness fell. Their job was to stay awake, to watch, to listen, and to raise the alarm if anything outside the walls warranted it. This was not ceremonial. The medieval world had genuine threats. Raiders, competing lords, brigands, the kind of opportunistic violence that a castle's walls were specifically designed to deter but not always able to prevent entirely. The watch called out at intervals through the night. Their voices, carrying across the inner courtyard, were one of the sounds that the castle's inhabitants fell asleep to. A familiar sound, a reassuring one. If you had grown up hearing it, it meant the watch was awake. It meant someone was paying attention. It meant you could, at least in theory, stop paying attention yourself and rest. But rest in the medieval castle was itself a more complicated proposition than the word suggests. Let us begin with where everyone slept, because this is perhaps the single most illuminating detail about the entire social world of the castle, and it is the detail that the romantic imagination most consistently gets wrong. The lord did not sleep alone. The lady did not sleep alone. No one of any importance in a medieval castle slept alone. Solitary sleep, the modern expectation of a single person in a private room with a closed door, would have seemed, to a medieval mind, not enviable, but strange, perhaps slightly alarming, certainly lonely in a way that carried negative rather than positive connotations. Privacy was not the goal. Closeness was the goal, and closeness in the castle was structural. The Lord's bedchamber, the inner sanctum of the castle's private quarters, the room that lay behind the great chamber and the antechamber, and sometimes a further anteroom, each successive space narrowing the circle of those permitted to pass, was not empty at night. The Lord slept in his great curtained bed, yes, but at the foot of that bed, on a pallet or a truckle bed that slid out from beneath the main bed during the day, slept a personal attendant. Sometimes, too, their job was to be there, to be present, to be available, to light a candle in the night if the Lord woke and wanted one, to fetch water, to assist with whatever was needed, to provide the simple human reassurance of not being alone in the dark, in a building full of people whose loyalty was never entirely beyond question. The curtains around the Lord's bed served a purpose that was partly thermal, trapping body heat inside the curtained space, creating a slightly warmer microclimate within the already cold room, and partly about the management of a very limited privacy within an inherently shared space. The curtain said, "This space, this small volume of air is mine. Everything outside the curtains is still shared. But here inside, there is a boundary. For the Lord's senior attendants, the knights, the household officers, the senior ladies in waiting who attended the lady of the castle, sleeping arrangements were slightly more spacious but still fundamentally communal. A knight might share a room with one or two others. A senior lady might have a bed she shared with her own attendant in a room off the lady's private chamber. Sharing a bed was entirely normal for people of all ranks, all genders, in non-sexual contexts, all ages. A bed was an expensive piece of furniture. A warm bed was a comfort. A shared warm bed was simply rational. Further down the hierarchy, the sleeping arrangements became correspondingly more compressed. Pages and squires, the young men and boys who were in the castle for training, slept in groups in the outer chambers, in corridors near their lord's quarters, wherever there was space to lay a pallet and a blanket. Some of the household accounts that survive describe sleeping rosters, arrangements for who slept where in the antechambers adjacent to the lord's quarters, the names of the young men assigned to sleep near the door. It reads in the dry Latin of a 14th century household record as purely administrative. But beneath the administrative language is the reality of a teenager sleeping on a hard floor outside a closed door in a cold corridor, listening to the watch call out over the battlements, probably not entirely comfortable and probably not entirely asleep until exhaustion made the matter irrelevant. The great hall, after supper was cleared and the trestle tables were folded and stacked against the walls, became a dormitory. This transformation happened every single night and was as much a part of the hall's function as the meals it served by day. The people who slept there, lower household servants, visiting retainers of no great rank, tradespeople who had business with the castle and were given hospitality for the night, arranged themselves across the rush-covered floor in their cloaks and whatever blankets the household provided, clustered near the fire if they were close enough to the high-status end to claim a spot nearby, further away from it if they were not. The hall at night, lit by the dying fire, and perhaps a single candle near the door, would have been a landscape of breathing bodies. The sound of collective sleep, the shifts and murmurs and occasional sleep sounds of 50 or 100 people in the same room, was simply the sound of the hall after dark. Anyone who has ever slept in a large shared dormitory, a hospital ward, a military barracks, will have some sense of it. The sleep of a crowd is a specific thing, not silent, not still, but with a rhythm to it, a human rhythm that is in its own way strangely reassuring. The fires could not be left entirely unattended through the night. A fire that collapsed inward and sent sparks onto the rush-covered floor was a catastrophe, and castle fires were not uncommon in the historical record. A designated person was responsible for banking the hall fire before sleep and checking it through the night. This was one of the least enviable jobs in the overnight hierarchy, requiring periodic waking through the hours when everyone else was allowed to be unconscious. The cold of the night settled into the stone. Medieval stone is a poor insulator, and stone that has been cooling since sunset is a different proposition from stone that has been absorbing the warmth of a day's fires. By the deep middle of the night in winter, The hall floor was cold in a way that worked through whatever was laid on top of it. Experienced sleepers knew to put distance between themselves and the stone, extra layers, a raised pallet if one was available, a position that minimized contact with the floor itself. And then, of course, there was the fear. Not the dramatic fear of a visible threat, not a siege, not an attack, not anything with a specific object. The subtler fear, the kind that is native to darkness and shared walls, and the knowledge that you are sealed inside a building with several hundred other people, some of whom you know well and trust completely, and some of whom you know only by sight and have no real basis for trusting at all. Medieval castles were sites of genuine internal danger. The historical record includes poisonings, private assassinations, sudden reversals of loyalty, the kind of intimate political violence that was possible precisely because everyone was living so close together. A lord who slept with attendants at the foot of his bed was not being attended to out of pure custom. He was, among other things, being guarded. The inner rooms of the castle, the solar, the private chambers, were positioned as far as possible from the main entrance, upstairs that forced any intruder to move slowly and noisily around spiral staircases designed specifically to disadvantage a right-handed swordsman attacking upward. The architecture of the private quarters was the architecture of defensive sleep. This is what I find most quietly telling about the castle at night. The walls that kept the outside world out also kept everyone inside together, in a closeness that could be comfort or threat depending on the moment. The same stone that sheltered you from the dark also enclosed you with everyone you had to trust in order to sleep. Night in a medieval castle was rest and vigilance at once, a lowering of the guard that was never entirely a lowering. And so they slept, the lord in his curtained bed, with his attendant at the foot, the knights in their shared chambers, the pages in the antechambers, the servants across the hall floor, the watch on the battlements calling out into the darkness, and the castle breathed around them all, cold and old and indifferent to rank, the stone the same temperature for everyone it enclosed. Morning would come again. The fires would need to be started again. The water would need to be drawn again. The entire enormous machinery of the castle's day would need to be set into motion again, beginning in the dark, beginning with footsteps. But before we arrive back at the morning, before we come full circle to that first pair of footsteps in the corridor that opened our journey tonight, there is one more thing we need to understand about this building and the people inside it. We have looked at the castle from many angles now. We have seen it in its noise and its smell and its cold and its dark. We have understood its hierarchy and its theater and its private discomforts. But we have not yet asked the most important question. Who actually kept it running? Not the Lord, not the knights, not the household officers in their important role. But people below, all of those people, the ones who never appeared in portraits, the ones whose names did not make it into the chronicles, the ones whose labor was so fundamental, so constant, so entirely built into the structure of the castle's daily functioning that it was invisible in the way that essential things always are, noticed only in their absence, taken for granted in their presence. We are going there next, into the last and deepest layer of the castle's story, the one that holds everything else up, But before we arrive there, before we meet the people the portraits forgot, I want to leave you with one image from the night we have just walked through together. Imagine the castle from outside, from a distance, in the deep middle of the night, when the gates are shut and the watch has called out for the last hour, and the fires inside are only a faint warmth behind the arrow-slit windows. From a distance, it looks impregnable, massive, cold, permanent. The kind of thing that will be standing long after everyone inside it is gone. And in most cases, of course, it was. The walls of medieval castles have outlasted everyone who ever lived within them by centuries. The stone is still there. The people are not. But inside that stone, at this moment, 200 human beings are breathing. Some of them are dreaming. Some of them are listening to the watch call out and feeling, for a moment, safe. Some of them are cold and pulling their cloak tighter around themselves on a hall floor that will not get any softer, no matter how they arrange themselves on it. Some of them are awake with worry, the lord calculating the cost of a dispute with a neighboring baron, the steward running figures in his head about the winter provision levels, a mother in the servants' quarters listening to a child cough and hoping it is nothing. Some of them are simply existing, breathing in and breathing out, being alive inside a stone building in a world that is cold and complicated and full of hierarchy and smell and noise and occasionally beauty. And in the morning, all of them will get up and do it again. That is the castle at night. Not impregnable, not cold, not a symbol or a fortress or a political statement. Just a building full of people trying to rest. And now, at last, we go to find the ones who made all of it possible. There is a set of keys in this story that we have not yet properly looked at. You have seen them, perhaps, in passing, hanging from a belt, mentioned in an inventory, glimpsed in the corner of an illuminated manuscript where a woman stands in a doorway and the keys at her side are rendered in careful detail by a scribe who understood, even if he never said so directly, that they mattered. Keys in a medieval castle were not decorative. They were not ceremonial, not symbolic in any empty sense of the word. They were entirely brutally practical objects that opened specific locks on specific doors and chests and cupboards, and whoever held them controlled access to whatever was behind those locks: food, medicine, candles, the locked strongbox where the household's cash was kept. The spice cabinet and spices in the medieval period were worth considerable sums, locked away as carefully as money because in many contexts they effectively were money. The linen store, where the household's tablecloths and bed linens were kept because fine linen was expensive and could disappear if left unwatched. The person who held all of these keys held, in the most literal possible sense, the castle's daily survival in her hands. And that person was almost always a woman. This is where we have been heading all night, through the noise of the morning and the theater of the great hall and the cold of the back corridors and the dark of the night watch. We have been circling slowly and deliberately toward the question at the heart of the castle's story. Who actually ran this place? The answer the portraits give you is the Lord, tall, armed, authoritative, seated at the center of every composition. The answer the records give you, if you read them carefully enough, the household accounts, the estate correspondence, the legal documents, the letters that survive from women to their husbands and stewards and lawyers, is more complicated and more interesting. The castle was run, in its daily operational reality, by the women who managed its interior systems, and at the center of those women holding the keys and the knowledge and the authority that went with both was the lady of the castle. She was not, let us be clear from the beginning, a decorative figure. The image of the medieval noblewoman as a passive ornamental presence, sitting at a high window doing embroidery, waiting for her husband to return from whatever men did beyond the walls, is one of history's more persistent and more misleading inventions. It was, to some extent, the image that certain medieval sources wanted to project. The idealized lady of courtly literature, still and beautiful and spiritually elevated, but courtly literature was not a documentary. It was aspiration. It was the fantasy of stillness projected onto women whose actual lives were anything but still. The lady of a castle of any size was, in practical terms, an executive, a manager of considerable scope and complexity. Her domain, the interior of the castle, the household's domestic operations, was not a subsidiary concern, a background hum beneath the more important business of the men. It was the infrastructure on which everything else ran. Without it functioning, nothing else could. Her responsibilities began with food. Not the cooking itself. That was delegated to the kitchen staff under the supervision of the head cook, but the provision of food, the management of the stores, the knowledge of what was in the undercroft and how long it would last, and when it needed replenishing, and what could be substituted if a particular supply ran short. This required a kind of knowledge that was simultaneously practical, numerical, and seasonal, an understanding of preservation techniques, of how long salted meat remained safe, of when the spring supplies of fresh food would become available again after the winter's dependence on preservation, of what the household's consumption rate actually was across a week, a month, a quarter. Household accounts from the 13th and 14th centuries, the painstaking daily records kept by castle stewards and chamberlains, reveal, in their dry columns of figures, the scale of what was being managed. A large castle household might consume dozens of loaves of bread daily, dozens of gallons of ale, quantities of meat and fish and dairy products that required constant restocking, careful storage, and vigilant monitoring for spoilage. Someone was responsible for knowing whether those numbers were right. Someone signed off on the purchases, verified the deliveries, noticed when the figures did not add up. In a well-run household, that oversight traced back, ultimately, to the lady. Her second domain was medicine. We have touched on this already, the medical stores, the herb knowledge, the practical healing that was embedded in the domestic structure of the castle, but it is worth dwelling on because it represents a form of authority that is easy to underestimate precisely because it was exercised quietly, without ceremony, in the ordinary course of daily life. When the castle's surgeon or physician was unavailable, and in most castle establishments below the very highest level of wealth, a trained physician was not a permanent resident, but an occasional visitor. The lady was the medical authority. Her still room, where she prepared her remedies, was as important to the castle's functioning as the kitchen. Her knowledge of which herb addressed which complaint, which preparation soothed a fever, and which reduced inflammation, and which could ease a difficult childbirth, was knowledge that people's lives depended on in the most direct sense. This was not soft knowledge. It was not peripheral. It was, in the medieval castle's practical reality, the difference between illness that was managed and illness that became catastrophe. Her third domain was people. The household staff, the dozens, sometimes hundreds of people who formed the working body of the castle, operated under a chain of authority that, for the domestic servants at least, ran through the lady. She knew, or was responsible for knowing, who was reliable and who was not, who was honest and who needed watching. Which of the kitchen staff had a grievance worth addressing, and which was simply difficult? Which of the laundresses had been with the household long enough to be trusted with the finest linen, and which was new and still learning? This kind of knowledge, the human knowledge, the knowledge of individuals and their particular characters and histories and loyalties, was not written down in any account. It lived in memory, in observation, in the accumulated experience of managing people over years and decades. It was perhaps the most difficult of all the lady's skills to acquire, and the most impossible to replace if it was lost. When a lady died young, or left a household through remarriage, or was separated from her castle during a lord's absence, the domestic machinery she had been sustaining did not automatically continue to run smoothly. Things fell through the gaps. Conflicts arose that her presence had been quietly preventing. The knowledge she had carried in her head, never written, never formally transferred, simply was not there anymore. Her absence made visible what her presence had rendered invisible. Her absence made visible what her presence had rendered invisible. And that invisibility was, in many ways, the defining condition of her authority. There is a particular kind of letter that survives from the medieval period, written by noble women to their husbands, to stewards, to lawyers, to the officers of distant estates, that deserves a moment of attention here. These letters are not love letters, though occasionally they contain moments of real personal feeling. They are working documents. They deal with cattle and grain and disputed boundaries and unpaid rents and the state of the timber on the north pasture, and whether the miller has been honest in his accounting. They are written with precision and with authority by women who understood the financial and legal landscape of their holdings in detailed, practical terms. Margaret Paston, the 15th century English noblewoman whose correspondence survives in remarkable completeness, wrote letters that read like the communications of a capable estate manager, because that is what she was. When her husband was absent, the Paston estates were in her hands. When they were threatened, she was the one who responded, sometimes in terms that make it clear she was prepared to defend her household by force if necessary. She was not unusual, she was documented. The undocumented women, those who managed smaller households, who left no letters behind, whose names do not appear in any archive, were doing the same work in the same way without the historical accident of surviving correspondence to preserve any trace of them. What I find so important about these letters and about the broader reality they represent is the gap they reveal between the official story and the lived one. The official story of the medieval castle places the lord at its center, politically, legally, militarily, and he was, in those specific domains, central. But the official story was never the whole story. It was the part of the story that official documents were designed to preserve. The rest was lived in stone corridors and locked storerooms and still rooms smelling of lavender, and the quiet rooms where the ladies' sat with their accounts and their correspondence and their knowledge of how everything worked. let us talk about the women below the lady, because the castle's female labor did not begin and end with the lord's wife. Below her, in descending order of status and visibility, was a hierarchy of women whose work was so fundamental to the castle's functioning that to remove it would have been to stop the building's heart. The senior ladies in waiting, the noble women who attended the lady, whose presence in her household was partly social and partly functional, who assisted with correspondence and with the management of her private chambers and with the complex social diplomacy of receiving guests, occupied a position that was simultaneously privileged and circumscribed. They were of good birth, often from families with ties to the Lord's own. They were educated, at least in the skills considered appropriate for women of their class: music, needlework, household management, the social arts of conversation and deportment. They were not servants in the lower sense, but they served. Below them, the chambermaids who maintained the private rooms, whose job in its daily reality consisted of making beds, emptying and cleaning chamber pots, carrying water, sweeping, dusting, maintaining the fire in the lady's chamber, helping with dressing and undressing, managing the clothing and the linen of the household's upper members. These were not minor tasks. The state of the private chambers reflected directly on the household's reputation, because those chambers were seen by guests of rank whose opinions mattered. A well-kept chamber with clean linen and a proper fire and the right objects in the right places communicated order and quality. A disordered one communicated the opposite. And in the medieval world, where a household's reputation was inseparable from a lord's political standing, the condition of his private rooms was not a domestic triviality. Further down, the laundresses. The castle's laundry operation was, by any measure, a significant industrial undertaking. The quantities of linen in a large household, the tablecloths, the napkins, the bed linen, the personal clothing, the kitchen cloths, the altar linens for the chapel, were enormous, and linen was not merely washed in the modern sense. It was beaten and boiled and wrung and stretched and laid out to dry in whatever weather the season offered, then folded and stored with a care that reflected its value. A tablecloth that had been laid for the high table, a set of bed linens that had dressed the Lord's bed. These were objects of genuine worth. Their maintenance was serious work, requiring physical strength, considerable skill, and the knowledge of how to treat different fabrics without damaging them. The laundresses worked outdoors when they could, in the yard or outside the walls where there was space for the work, and indoors in winter. They were among the most physically demanding workers in the castle, and among the least visible in any formal account of what the castle contained or how it functioned. And below them, or alongside them, in the hierarchy of invisible labor, the women who carried and fetched and cleaned, whose names appear in household accounts only as part of a collective. The women of the kitchen, the laundry women, the dairymaids, never as individuals, never as persons with histories and knowledge and particular skills, just a category of labor, a line in a budget. What I want to say about all of these women, from the lady at the top to the unnamed dairymaid at the bottom, is this. The castle that we have been walking through tonight, with all its stone and its cold and its smell and its hierarchy, did not sustain itself. It was sustained every morning by the same effort, the same knowledge, the same hands moving through the same tasks that had to be done again because they had been done yesterday and would need to be done again tomorrow. The Lord held the keys to the castle's power in the political sense, his military authority, his legal standing, his relationship with the king above him and the tenants below. The lady held the keys to the castle's survival in the physical sense, the locked stores, the medical knowledge, the human intelligence that kept the household's daily machinery running without visible seam. Both kinds of key were necessary. Only one of them was painted. And yet, here is the part that history quietly confirms again and again in the records that do survive. When the Lord was absent, the castle continued to function. When a medieval lord rode to war, or traveled to court, or was called away for months to manage a legal dispute or attend upon the king, he did not take the castle with him. He left it, and it ran. The food was still managed, the stores were still monitored, the sick were still treated. The servants were still supervised. The rents from the outlying estates were still collected. The disputes among the tenants were still settled. This happened because the lady was there. And sometimes, in the historical record, more often than the romantic image of medieval womanhood would suggest, the castle was not merely administered in the Lord's absence, it was defended. The siege of Bamberg Castle in 1462 involved a woman negotiating its surrender. The defense of various English and French castles during the 100 Years' War included women commanding the garrison, directing the archers, deciding when to capitulate and when to hold. The Countess of Bouchon in 1306 held Berwick Castle under siege when no male successor was present to do so. Nicola de la Haye held Lincoln Castle against attack twice, in 1191 and again in 1217, and was appointed Sheriff of Lincolnshire in recognition of her competence. These were not exceptional aberrations in an otherwise passive female existence. They were the visible surface of a much broader pattern. Women who had been managing the daily operations of complex institutions for years, and who discovered when crisis arrived that management and defense were not as different as the official categories suggested. You ran the castle every day. When someone threatened to take it, you ran it against them. The key holders knew the building. They knew its weaknesses and its strengths. They knew where the stores were and how long they would last. They knew the people and could judge who would hold and who would not. This was not military training. It was domestic knowledge deployed in extremity. And it worked. There is one more figure I want to bring into this room before we leave the castle behind. Not the lady, not a named historical figure of any great consequence. A woman we do not know the name of. She appears, in a way, in the records of dozens of medieval castle households. Not by name, but by function. She is the woman who in the estate correspondence of a lord away on campaign is referred to only as she who manages the household in my lady's absence. She is the woman who in a household account appears as a payment to the woman who kept the stores during the mistress's illness 4 shillings. She is the woman in the inventory who is described in the margin as knowing the disposition of all things within. She was the institutional memory. She was the woman who had been in the castle so long and paid such close and continuous attention to its workings that she carried in her head the knowledge that no document preserved. She knew which section of the undercroft had the damp problem that made certain foods go off faster than expected. She knew that the well drew slower in summer and that the kitchen needed to compensate by drawing earlier in the day. She knew which of the kitchen staff could be trusted with a spice cabinet and which had light fingers. She knew that the Lord's mother had arranged a particular room in a particular way, and that he preferred it kept as she had left it. She knew, she had always known. She would go on knowing until she died or left, and when she went, so would everything she had carried. This is history's great archival problem with the medieval castle. The official records, the accounts, the legal documents, the charters, captured the castle's transactions. They did not capture its knowledge. They did not capture the texture of daily life, the unwritten rules, the practical intelligence that made the building habitable. That intelligence lived in people, in women largely, in the accumulated, practiced, transmitted knowledge of how to run a complicated human institution inside stone walls, with the resources available through every season, year after year. It was never written down because it did not need to be written down. It was lived, it was present. It was as much a part of the castle as the walls themselves, and far more easily lost. We have come a long way tonight. We walked in before dawn, when the castle was already awake and working, and the first footsteps were moving through the dark corridor toward the fire. We sat in the great hall and learned to read the room by where people sat, and what was on their plates, and how far they were from the salt. We stood in the cold corridors and the colder garderobes and understood what it cost, physically, simply to inhabit this building through a winter. We followed the darkness down as the gates closed and the fires banked, and 200 people arranged themselves for sleep in arrangements that tell us more about medieval life than almost anything else, who shared a bed, who slept at the foot of the Lord's bed, who lay on the hall floor in a cloak. And now we have arrived here, at the end, in the room behind all the other rooms, with the women who held the keys. What the castle reveals in the end is something very simple and very profound about how power actually functions. Official power, the power in the portraits, the power with the sword and the seal and the great chair at the high table, is visible and acknowledged and recorded. It is the power that history remembers, because it is the power that left traces in the kinds of documents historians have traditionally looked for: charters, chronicles, legal proceedings, letters between powerful men about the disposition of lands and armies and political alliances. But beneath that official power, holding it up, sustaining the daily material reality without which no amount of political authority means anything at all, there was another kind of power, quieter, more constant, less dramatic, the power of knowing, of managing, of being present every day, through every season, with the knowledge and the capability to keep several hundred human lives functioning inside stone walls. That power was real, it was essential, and it was exercised, day after day, by people who were very rarely named in the records. The castle was magnificent. It was cold and smelled of smoke and was full of dogs and was never, not for a single hour, quiet. It was a machine for making hierarchy visible, and it succeeded at this completely. But it was also, underneath all of that machinery, simply a place where people lived. where people got cold and got sick and worried about the winter stores and carried water and made the beds and emptied the chamber pots and stirred the pottage and rang the bells and watched the gate and sat by the fire and tried, in the way that human beings have always tried, to make the world they inhabited a little more bearable. The stone is still standing. The people are gone. But tonight, for a few hours, we found them again, in the footsteps before dawn, in the keys on the belt, in the fire that someone got up in the night to tend. If tonight's story found you, if the castle felt real in a way it did not before, I would love to have you stay. Subscribe to Dreamy Ages, and there will be another journey waiting whenever you are ready. For now, though, the fire is low. The watch has called out for the last time. The castle is as quiet as it ever gets. Sleep well.